He bought an abandoned airport terminal buried under 10 feet of snow for just $800, thinking he'd found a place to hide from the world and heal his wounds in silence. But when Marcus Rivera broke through the frozen control room door that had been sealed for 43 years, he didn't just find shelter from his nightmares. He found $205 million in cash, gold, and bonds hidden by men who were supposed to be dead, and a conspiracy that would put his life in danger the moment he touched a single bill. Before we dive into this incredible true story, make sure to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow we're sharing another mind-blowing tale that will leave you speechless. Now, let's begin. The February wind cut through the mountains of upstate New York like a blade made of ice and regret. Marcus Rivera sat in his rusted pickup truck outside the Adirondack County Courthouse, engine rattling like loose change in a coffee can, heater barely functional, staring at a crumpled newspaper clipping that had been pinned to the Veterans Center bulletin board for 3 weeks. The headline read, "Municipal Assets Auction, Airport Terminal Complex, Minimum Bid $500. Marcus was 34 years old, though the lines carved around his eyes and the weight that had settled permanently in his shoulders made him look closer to 50. 3 tours in Afghanistan had left him with a Purple Heart collecting dust in a shoebox, a limp that ached in cold weather like a barometer made of bone, and nights filled with dreams that weren't dreams at all but memories wrapped in smoke and screaming metal. The kind of memories that made sleep feel like enemy territory. The VA checks barely covered his studio apartment rent in a building where the heat worked sporadically, and the walls were thin enough that he could hear his neighbors arguing, laughing, living lives that seemed impossibly normal. The jobs he could handle: night security at empty office buildings, inventory work in windowless warehouses, anything that didn't require too much interaction with people who asked questions or expected small talk, never lasted long. Not when you flinched every time a car backfired or a door slammed too hard. Not when crowded spaces made your chest tight and your hands shake. Not when the sound of helicopters overhead sent you diving for cover behind parked cars while strangers stared and whispered. He'd been living day by day, check by check, pill by pill, when he saw the auction notice 3 weeks ago. An abandoned airport terminal sitting on 47 acres in the Adirondack foothills. The place had been closed since 1979, forgotten by everyone except the tax assessor's office and now the county, which wanted it gone badly enough to practically give it away. The black and white photograph showed a brutalist concrete structure half buried in snow, looking more like a Cold War bunker than anything meant for civilian aircraft. But what caught Marcus's attention wasn't the building itself, or even the impossibly low starting bid. It was the isolation. 47 acres of nothing but pine trees, mountain silence, and distance from a world that felt too loud, too fast, too full of sounds that made his heart race and his hands shake without warning. A place where he could disappear without anyone asking questions or expecting answers he didn't have. A place where the only voices would be the wind through the trees and his own thoughts, which were dark enough but at least familiar. The parking lot outside the courthouse was nearly empty, unusual for a Tuesday morning. Most auction days brought contractors hunting for salvage rights, developers looking for cheap land, curious locals with nothing better to do. Today, only a handful of vehicles sat scattered across the cracked asphalt. Marcus recognized the rusted sedan belonging to Bill Hendricks, a local contractor who specialized in demolition and scrap metal. There was an expensive black SUV with Albany plates that probably belonged to some downstate developer who'd driven up on speculation. And his own truck, a 1997 Ford with more rust than paint, and an exhaust system held together with prayer and zip ties. Marcus killed the engine and listened to it shudder into silence. The courthouse steps were slick with ice that had been accumulating since the latest storm 3 days ago. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he made his way up the steps, each one sending a sharp reminder through his left knee, where shrapnel had found its mark outside Kandahar 6 years ago. The auction room was exactly what he'd expected. Folding chairs arranged in uneven rows, a podium that looked like it had been built during the Carter administration, fluorescent lights that hummed and flickered overhead. Maybe 15 people total, most of them looking like they were there to kill time rather than spend money. Marcus chose a seat in the back, close to the exit, a habit that had become automatic since he'd been home. Always know where the exits are. Always sit where you can see the whole room. Always be ready to move fast if things went wrong. The metal chair was cold even through his jacket, and he kept his hands in his pockets to hide the slight tremor that never quite went away anymore. The auctioneer was a thin man in his 60s, wearing a suit that had seen better decades. He shuffled through paperwork with the tired efficiency of someone who'd been doing this job long enough to know that most auction days were exercises in futility, moving unwanted property from one desperate owner to another. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice echoing off the institutional green walls, "we have 3 items up for bid today. 2 residential properties in tax default, and 1 commercial property being sold by the county to settle a lien dispute. We'll start with the Mitchell property on Route 9. Marcus only half listened to the bidding on the first 2 properties. A mobile home with a collapsed roof went for $1,200. A cabin with no running water sold for $800. The kinds of desperate purchases made by people who'd run out of better options, which described pretty much everyone in the room. "Now we come to our final item," the auctioneer said, consulting his notes. "Lot number 3, the former Millbrook Regional Airport Terminal Complex. 47 acres, including the main terminal building, control tower, 2 aircraft hangars, and associated runway infrastructure. Property has been vacant since 1979. Buyer takes full responsibility for environmental assessment, structural integrity, and access road maintenance." He looked up over his reading glasses at the sparse crowd. "Folks, I'm required to tell you that this property has some unique challenges. The access road is impassable to standard vehicles for approximately 2 miles. The building has no utilities power, was disconnected in 1981, water in 1983. Previous inspections have noted structural concerns, though no formal engineering assessment has been completed." Marcus felt something stir in his chest. Not excitement, exactly, but something he hadn't felt in months. Interest, purpose, maybe. The kind of focus that used to come when he was planning a patrol route through hostile territory, weighing risks against objectives. "That said," the auctioneer continued, "it's 47 acres with development potential for someone with vision and deep pockets. Minimum bid is $500. Do I have 500? Silence filled the room like water settling into low places. Marcus looked around at the other potential bidders. Bill Hendricks was shaking his head and gathering his papers. The woman next to him was studying her phone. The man in the expensive coat was already heading for the exit. "Come on, folks," the auctioneer tried again. $500 for 47 acres. That's about $11 an acre. You can't buy a parking space in Albany for $11. More silence. Marcus found himself thinking about the photograph in the listing. About all that empty space where the only sounds would be wind and wildlife. About a place where no one would expect him to be normal, where his jumpiness and sleepless nights wouldn't mark him as broken. "Do I have 400?" the auctioneer asked, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. Marcus raised his hand before he could talk himself out of it. "Thank you. I have 400 from the gentleman in the back." "Do I have 5? Nobody moved. The auctioneer waited, scanning the room hopefully, but the few remaining people were either leaving or pointedly avoiding eye contact. Going once, at 400, going twice. He paused, looking directly at Marcus, with an expression that mixed gratitude with sympathy. "Sold. 2. Bidder number 47 for $400. Marcus felt his heart pound as he realized what he'd just done. $400 was grocery money. For 2 months. It was his emergency fund, his safety net, the difference between making rent and sleeping in his truck. But it was also the price of 47 acres of silence, and a building that nobody else wanted. The paperwork took 20 minutes. The county clerk, a tired woman who looked like she'd processed too many desperate transactions, handed him a manila envelope containing the deed, a property survey that was older than he was, and a set of keys that looked like they belonged in a museum. "Congratulations, Mr. Rivera," she said without enthusiasm. "You're now the proud owner of the old Millbrook Regional Airport. Fair warning, the road's washed out about 2 miles in. Been that way since Hurricane Agnes back in '72. You'll need 4-wheel drive or a lot of patience. And like Tom said, there's no power, no water, no phone service. Place has been empty for 30 years. Marcus pocketed the keys and studied the survey map. The property was shaped like a rough rectangle, bordered by state forest land on 3 sides and a seasonal creek on the 4th. The terminal building sat roughly in the center, connected to what had once been Route 27 by a road that the map optimistically labeled as improved gravel. "Any idea why it's been empty so long?" Marcus asked. The clerk shrugged. "Economics, mostly. Place was built in the late '60s when they thought regional air travel was the future. Turns out people preferred driving to Albany or flying out of bigger airports. Went bankrupt in '78, officially closed in '79. County's been trying to get rid of it ever since." She lowered her voice slightly, glancing around as if sharing gossip. "Course, some folks say there was more to it than economics. Strange flights coming and going, cargo that never appeared on any manifest, that sort of thing. But you know how people talk in small towns." Marcus nodded and headed for the parking lot, his mind already turning over possibilities. The building might be structurally sound even if it lacked utilities. The land was definitely valuable, even if it wasn't accessible. And the isolation that made it worthless to developers made it perfect for someone who wanted to disappear from the world for a while. The drive north into the mountains took almost an hour, winding through pine forests and past frozen lakes that reflected the gray sky like mirrors made of ice. The last town of any size was Millbrook itself, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a single traffic light. Beyond that, civilization thinned to occasional farmhouses and hunting camps, then disappeared entirely as the road climbed into genuine wilderness. Marcus found the turnoff marked by a rusted sign that was barely legible. Millbrook Regional Airport. Authorized vehicles only. The warning seemed optimistic, given that the road beyond the sign looked like it hadn't seen authorized vehicles in decades. What had once been blacktop was now more pothole than pavement, overgrown with saplings and choked with fallen logs that had been accumulating since the last serious maintenance sometime during the Reagan administration. Marcus's truck groaned and lurched through the snow-packed ruts, transmission whining in protest. Four-wheel drive working harder than it had since he'd bought the vehicle 3 years ago. Twice he got stuck and had to dig himself out with the military surplus entrenching tool he kept in the bed, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he cursed and scraped at ice that had the consistency of concrete. His knee complained with every shovelful, sending sharp reminders up his leg that some kinds of damage never fully healed. The road climbed steadily through dense forest, switching back on itself like a drunk man's signature. Pine trees pressed close on both sides, their branches heavy with snow that occasionally dumped onto his windshield with wet, muffled thuds. No tire tracks except his own. No footprints. No signs that anyone had been this way in years. When he finally reached the terminal complex after nearly 40 minutes of brutal driving, the building loomed before him, like something from a post-apocalyptic movie. The structure was massive, easily 3 stories tall and 200 feet long, built from poured concrete that had weathered to the color of old bones. Snow had drifted against the walls in sculpted waves, some reaching nearly to the second-floor windows. The control tower rose from the center like the spine of some sleeping beast, its windows dark and empty as dead eyes. Marcus parked beside what had once been the main entrance and cut the engine. The silence was immediate and complete in a way that city dwellers never experienced. No traffic, no voices, no machinery, no sounds except the whisper of wind through pine branches and the distant crack of ice settling somewhere deep in the forest. For the first time in months, his shoulders relaxed. The constant tension that lived between his shoulder blades, the hypervigilance that made him check every shadow and monitor every sound, began to ease. He grabbed his flashlight from the glove box and walked toward the entrance. The main doors were steel, industrial grade, secured with chains and padlocks that had rusted solid over the decades. Marcus tried the keys the county had given him, but none of them fit the ancient locks. The metal was corroded beyond the point where standard tools would help. He walked the perimeter of the building, boots crunching through snow that reached his knees in places, looking for another way in. The concrete walls showed their age cracks running like spider webs, sections where the rebar underneath had rusted and expanded, pushing chunks of concrete onto the ground below. But the basic structure looked sound, built to last by people who understood that airports needed to withstand whatever weather the mountains could throw at them. On the east side of the building, he found what he was looking for: a loading dock with a roll-up door that had buckled in the center, probably from years of thermal expansion and contraction. The buckling had created a gap just wide enough for a determined person to squeeze through if they didn't mind scraping some paint off their jacket. The metal shrieked in protest as Marcus forced the gap wider, the sound echoing off the concrete walls and sending a flight of crows spiraling up from nearby trees. He clicked on his flashlight and stepped into darkness that felt alive with decades of stillness. The beam revealed a cavernous cargo bay with oil stains on the floor, marking where equipment had once been positioned. The ceiling disappeared into shadows above, supported by massive concrete pillars that gave the space a cathedral-like quality. The air smelled of rust, old grease, and something else, something organic and faint that made his skin prickle with the kind of primitive warning that had kept his ancestors alive when humans were prey as often as predators. Marcus moved deeper into the building, his footsteps echoing in the vast space with a hollow quality that spoke of true emptiness. He found a stairwell leading to the upper levels and climbed carefully, testing each step for structural integrity. The concrete was solid despite its age, built with the kind of over-engineering that characterized public projects from an era when budgets were larger and corners were cut less frequently. The second floor opened into what had once been the main terminal, a long corridor lined with gate areas, their windows looking out onto runways that were now buried under years of forest growth. Snow had blown in through broken windows, creating drifts against the walls like white sand dunes that had been sculpted by wind into shapes that almost looked deliberate. Empty door frames marked where shops and restaurants had once operated. A few pieces of furniture remained, chairs bolted to the floor, a ticket counter with drawers hanging open, a departures board with letters scattered beneath it like alphabet soup. Everything covered in dust thick enough to write in, undisturbed except by the occasional mouse tracks that crisscrossed the floor. But it was the third floor that stopped Marcus in his tracks. As he climbed the final staircase, his flashlight beam caught something unexpected. A door marked, "Authorized, personnel, only," that wasn't just locked, but sealed. Heavy-duty metal plates had been welded across the frame with professional precision, and someone had painted, "Condemned, no entry," in red letters that had barely faded despite decades of abandonment. Marcus ran his fingers along the welded seams, feeling the smooth lines of work done by someone who knew their trade. This wasn't amateur security or bureaucratic caution. The welds were perfect, thorough, designed to keep people out permanently, or to keep something in. His pulse quickened, not the familiar spike of anxiety that came with crowds or sudden noises, but something else. Curiosity mixed with purpose, the kind of focus that used to come when he spotted something during patrol that didn't belong, that represented either opportunity or threat, depending on how you approached it. He went back to his truck and retrieved his toolbox, including the cutting torch he'd bought years ago when he'd briefly tried making money doing freelance welding. The tank was nearly empty, but it had enough acetylene left for what he needed to do. The metal plates came away reluctantly, showering sparks that hissed and steamed against the snow that had drifted into the hallway. Behind the plates was a door marked "Control Room, Flight Operations," in letters that looked official and permanent. The door itself was different from the others he'd seen in the building, heavier, with a more sophisticated locking mechanism and what appeared to be a rubber seal around the frame. The keyhole was smaller and more precise than the standard hardware elsewhere in the terminal. Marcus tried the keys from his envelope, working through them methodically. The fourth one slid in smoothly and turned with a click that seemed to echo through time itself. The sound of a mechanism that had been waiting 4 decades for someone to find the right combination of desperation and curiosity. The door swung open on hinges that moved silently despite decades of disuse, revealing a room that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat like a physical blow. Unlike every other space in the terminal, this room was pristine. No dust, no debris, no signs of decay or abandonment. The air that flowed out was dry and clean, carrying the faint scent of electronics and something else. Something that reminded him of counting houses and bank vaults. Banks of electronic equipment lined the walls, their screens dark but their surfaces polished clean, as if someone had been maintaining them regularly. Charts and maps covered every available inch of wall space, marked with flight paths and coordinates in handwriting so neat it looked printed. Radio equipment from an era when vacuum tubes were still common sat beside more modern devices that Marcus didn't recognize. But it wasn't the equipment that made Marcus step back in shock, his flashlight beam trembling in his suddenly unsteady hand. It was what sat in the center of the room, a steel table, spotlessly clean, supporting neat stacks of cash. Not bills scattered randomly like some drug dealer's stash, but money organized with military precision that spoke of people who understood logistics, planning, and the kind of patience that could wait decades for the right moment. Bundles of hundreds, 50s, 20s, all held with rubber bands that looked fresh despite the obvious age of some of the currency. Arranged in perfect rows, like soldiers standing at attention. Behind the table, Marcus could see more stacks. These, reaching nearly to the ceiling, in columns that had been built, with the kind of systematic care usually reserved for ammunition, storage, or other materials, where accuracy and organization could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. And beside the cash, wooden crates with stenciled markings he didn't recognize, but that made his combat-trained instincts scream warnings. The kind of markings that appeared on equipment that was sensitive, valuable, or dangerous enough to require special handling procedures. Marcus approached slowly, his flashlight beam dancing across more money than he'd seen in his entire life combined. The bills weren't crisp and new. Many were yellowed with age, worn at the edges from handling, marked with the kinds of stamps and notations that suggested they'd traveled through official channels before ending up in this room. But they were real. He picked up one bundle, fanned through it quickly, with fingers that had handled enough military payouts to recognize authentic currency. All hundreds, all legitimate as far as he could tell, all bound together with the kind of systematic organization that suggested military or government origin. His hands shook as he set the bundle back down exactly where he'd found it. This wasn't lost money or some criminal's hidden stash. This was something official, something planned and executed with the kind of precision that required resources, authority, and access to systems that ordinary people never touched. He moved to the wooden crates and found them filled with items that made his breath come shorter. Gold coins in protective sleeves, jewelry that looked both expensive and historical, and what appeared to be bearer bonds in multiple currencies. Everything was catalogued, labeled with codes that meant nothing to him, but spoke of systematic organization and long-term planning. A clipboard hung from a nail on the wall, its pages filled with entries in multiple handwritings, all documenting additions to what was clearly an inventory of extraordinary value. The earliest entries were dated 1975. The most recent, in different handwriting from the others, was dated March 19, 1979, just weeks before the airport had officially closed, and simply read, "Operation terminated. Assets secure. Awaiting final disposition." Marcus sank into a chair that had been positioned at the table, his mind reeling with implications he was only beginning to understand. This wasn't some fortunate accident or treasure hidden by eccentric millionaires. The dates, the organization, the official nature of the documentation, everything pointed to government involvement at the highest levels. The terminal hadn't just been a failing regional airport. According to what he was seeing, it had been something else entirely. Something that had required the kind of security and secrecy that left rooms sealed for decades, while millions of dollars sat waiting for a disposition that had never come. His flashlight beam fell across a metal filing cabinet in the corner, and Marcus found himself moving toward it, as if pulled by invisible strings. The drawers weren't locked, which itself seemed significant. Inside were hundreds of documents, flight manifests for aircraft that didn't appear on any public records, cargo lists that used codes instead of descriptions, personnel records for people whose names had been redacted from every document he could find. But one name appeared frequently enough that Marcus couldn't ignore it: Project Coldstream. And according to the final report in the file, Project Coldstream had been terminated with extreme prejudice in March of 1979, just weeks before the airport closed forever. Marcus sat in that pristine room, surrounded by what had to be millions of dollars in cash, gold, and bonds, reading about a government operation that officially had never existed. The money wasn't lost or stolen. It was abandoned, left behind, when something had gone wrong with a plan that was supposed to end differently. And now, through a combination of desperation and dumb luck, he owned it all. The wind outside picked up as the afternoon light began to fade, howling through the broken windows in the floors below, but Marcus barely heard it. He was staring at a photograph he'd found in the bottom of the filing cabinet. 6 men in civilian clothes, standing beside a small aircraft, all of them smiling at the camera with the confidence of people who believed their secrets were safe. The back of the photo was dated March 15, 1979, and someone had written in careful handwriting, "Final departure, Phase 3, complete. Assets, secured, pending transition." None of the men looked familiar, but something about their faces, their posture, their clothes, spoke of authority and access to resources that ordinary people never touched. These weren't criminals or smugglers operating in shadows. These were officials, government men, who had the kind of clearance and connections that could make problems disappear and ensure that inconvenient questions never got asked. Marcus set the photograph down and looked around the room again. The money seemed different now, not like a treasure but like evidence. Evidence of something that powerful people had wanted buried forever. Something they'd been willing to abandon millions of dollars to keep secret. His hands were shaking again, but not from his usual anxiety or the cold air seeping through the building's aging infrastructure. This was fear of a different kind. The kind that came from stumbling into something far bigger and more dangerous than himself. He thought about loading the money into his truck, driving away, starting a new life somewhere far from here, where $800 could become $8 million, and no one would ask uncomfortable questions. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was impossible. Money like this didn't just disappear without consequences. People who could organize operations like Coldstream, who had the resources and connections to maintain sealed rooms in abandoned government facilities, didn't just forget about millions of dollars no matter how long it had been hidden. And if he started spending cash this old, this systematically organized, someone would notice. The kind of people who had access to government resources and the patience to wait decades for the right moment. But there was something else. Something that kept him in that chair as the afternoon light faded outside. The control tower windows and shadows began to lengthen across the money that had been waiting 43 years for someone to find it. The files mentioned other names, other operations, other cover-ups that had cost lives and destroyed families in service of objectives that remained classified decades after the fact. Whatever Project Coldstream had been, it hadn't ended in 1979. It had just moved underground, adapted to changing circumstances, found new ways to operate while maintaining the same basic structure of secrecy and unaccountability. Marcus thought about his fellow veterans, the ones who'd come home broken like him, fighting battles with a government that seemed more interested in forgetting them than helping them heal. He thought about the promises that had been made and broken, the benefits that were always under review, the medical care that was consistently underfunded, the pills that dulled the pain but never addressed the causes. What if this money wasn't just abandoned government assets? What if it was meant to be found by someone who understood what it was like to be used by the system and then discarded when the mission was complete? Marcus stood up, his decision crystallizing like ice forming in his veins. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to hide. He was going to find out what Project Coldstream had been, who had authorized it, why they'd been willing to abandon enough money to change 1,000 lives, and most importantly, whether it was still operating under different names and classifications. But first, he needed to secure the room and its contents. If this fortune had been hidden for 43 years, it could stay hidden a little longer while he figured out how to use it properly. As darkness fell outside the control room windows and the temperature inside the unheated building began to drop toward freezing, Marcus Rivera realized he hadn't just bought an abandoned airport terminal for $800. He'd inherited a mystery that stretched back decades, involved people who were supposed to be untouchable, and somehow connected him to events that had supposedly ended before he was born. The money was just the beginning. The real treasure or curse was the truth that came with it. Marcus didn't sleep that first night in the terminal. Instead, he sat in the control room reading files by flashlight, trying to piece together a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex and dangerous with each document he examined. By dawn, his eyes burned from strain, and his head pounded from too much caffeine and too little rest. But he'd begun to understand the scope of what he'd stumbled into and why it had been sealed away for 4 decades. Project Coldstream hadn't been a single operation but a network of them spanning nearly 5 years, from 1975 to 1979. The airport terminal had served as a hub for flights that carried everything from cash to weapons to people who needed to disappear permanently. The manifests were written in military code that Marcus's combat experience helped him decipher enough to realize the operation had tentacles reaching into every level of government, from local contractors to congressional oversight committees. What made his blood run cold as he sat surrounded by millions in cash was how recent some of the activity appeared to be. The final entries in the logbooks were dated March 1979, but several of the names mentioned in the files belonged to people who were not only still alive, but still in positions of significant power. Senators whose careers had begun in the late 70s, federal judges appointed during the Reagan years, military contractors whose companies had grown from small regional operations into defense industry giants, intelligence officials, whose influence had only expanded with time. Marcus drove back to civilization that morning, with questions burning in his mind and a plan forming despite every instinct. Screaming that he was walking into danger he couldn't possibly understand. The Veterans Center in Millbrook was a converted warehouse where guys like him went to trade stories, get help navigating the bureaucratic maze of benefits claims, and pretend they weren't drowning in memories they couldn't forget or nightmares they couldn't escape. The director, a former Marine named Tommy Costa, had been trying to get Marcus to open up for months about his experiences overseas and his struggles with civilian life. Tommy understood the particular hell of coming home from a war zone, to find that the world had moved on without you, that the skills that had kept you alive in combat had no place in a society that wanted its veterans grateful and quiet. Today, Marcus thought, might be the day to start talking. He found Tommy in the center's main room, helping an older veteran fill out disability paperwork that would probably disappear into the same bureaucratic black hole that had swallowed thousands of similar claims. Tommy looked up when Marcus approached, his weathered face showing surprise. Marcus rarely initiated conversations, preferring to sit quietly in corners and listen to other people's problems, rather than discuss his own. "Hey, stranger," Tommy said, setting down his pen. "You look like you've been up all night wrestling with demons you can't pin down." "Something like that," Marcus replied, choosing his words carefully. "Tommy, You ever hear of anything called Project Coldstream? The effect was immediate and unsettling. Tommy's pen stopped moving across the paper as if frozen in place. The older veteran, whose name tag read Frank, glanced up sharply from his paperwork. His eyes suddenly focused and alert in a way that suggested the question had triggered memories he'd spent decades trying to bury. For a moment that stretched too long, the room felt charged with tension that hadn't been there seconds before. Marcus could practically feel the shift in atmosphere. The way conversations at nearby tables seemed to quiet, as if people were unconsciously responding to some primitive warning signal. "Where'd you hear that name?" Tommy asked quietly, his voice carrying the kind of careful control that came from years of handling explosive situations. Marcus had prepared for this question, knowing he needed to reveal enough to get answers, without exposing himself to more danger than he could handle. "Found some old documents when I was cleaning out a building I bought. Military stuff from the 70s. Made me curious about what kind of operations were running back then." Frank, the older veteran, slowly gathered his paperwork with movements that seemed casual, but were actually precise and deliberate. "Think I'll come back later to finish this," he said, his voice neutral but his actions speaking of someone who'd learned when conversations were too dangerous to overhear. After Frank left, walking perhaps a little faster than his age would normally require, Tommy leaned back in his chair and studied Marcus, with eyes that had seen too much combat and too many lies to be fooled by casual questions. "You sure you just found some random documents?" Tommy asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "I'm sure I found something that's got me worried about who else might be looking for it, and I'm sure that if I don't understand what I'm dealing with, I'm going to end up in serious trouble." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, weighing risks and loyalties that Marcus could only guess at. Finally, he stood and walked to the center's front door, checking the parking lot, before turning the deadbolt and flipping the sign to closed. He gestured for Marcus to follow him to a back office that served as his private workspace. The walls were covered with photographs of Marines from different eras, newspaper clippings about veteran issues, and commendations from Tommy's own service. But what caught Marcus's attention were the filing cabinets along one wall, secured with locks that looked far more sophisticated than anything needed for routine administrative work. "Coldstream isn't something you just stumble across," Tommy said, settling into his chair with the careful movements of someone whose body carried old injuries. "It's something that finds you when you're not supposed to be alive to remember it." Marcus felt his pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with anxiety and everything to do with the recognition that he'd found someone who understood what he was facing. "You know about it." Tommy laughed, but there was no humor in the sound, only the bitter recognition of someone who'd lived with dangerous secrets for too long. "I was part of it. Briefly. Back when I was young and stupid enough to believe everything they told me was necessary for national security and the greater good." Tommy opened a desk drawer and pulled out a bottle of whiskey that looked like it had been opened for special occasions and emergencies. He poured 2 shots, despite the early hour, pushing one toward Marcus and downing the other himself before continuing. "Coldstream started sometime in 75. Tommy said, his voice carrying the weight of memories he'd spent decades trying to forget. "Officially, it was about moving sensitive materials and personnel out of areas where we were losing strategic influence. Vietnam was ending badly. Our intelligence networks were being compromised faster than we could rebuild them. And a lot of people who'd worked for us needed to disappear before they could be captured and forced to reveal operational details. Marcus sipped the whiskey, feeling it burn his throat in a way that seemed appropriate for the conversation. What about unofficially? Tommy's expression darkened like clouds gathering before a storm. Unofficially, it was the biggest money laundering and asset relocation scheme the government ever ran. We weren't just moving people and equipment out of compromised areas. We were moving fortunes. Gold, cash, artifacts, bonds, anything of value that needed to vanish from official records while remaining accessible to people with the right clearance and connections. Marcus felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together in his mind. What happened to it? Tommy was quiet for so long that Marcus thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might summon the attention of people who were better left undisturbed. Someone got greedy, started skimming from the operations, selling information to foreign governments, using classified intelligence for personal profit. When the brass found out, they shut everything down hard and fast. Terminated the entire program in March of '79. Terminated how? Tommy stared into his empty glass for a moment before answering. 7 people knew the full scope of Coldstream operations. By April of '79, 6 of them were dead. Car accidents, heart attacks, suicide. 1 plane crash that was blamed on mechanical failure. All very convenient, very natural looking for anyone who didn't know what to look for. Marcus felt the room grow cold in a way that had nothing to do with the building's inadequate heating system. And the 7th person? Disappeared. Along with about $200 million in operational funds that were supposed to be transferred to secure storage facilities. The silence stretched between them until Marcus couldn't stand it anymore. The weight of what he knew pressed against his chest like a physical force, demanding release, even though he understood that speaking the truth would change everything irrevocably. "Tommy," he said quietly, "I think I found that money." Money. Tommy's glass slipped from his fingers, hitting the desk with a sound like a gunshot that seemed to echo long after the whiskey had finished, spreading across the papers scattered there. Neither man moved to clean it up, both frozen by the implications of what had just been said. "Jesus Christ, Marcus," Tommy whispered. "Tell me you're lying. Tell me you're having some kind of breakdown and making this up." Marcus shook his head slowly. "Airport terminal I bought yesterday. There's a sealed room full of more cash than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. And files. Documentation. Everything about Coldstream and operations I've never heard of." Tommy stood up so fast his chair rolled backward into the wall with a crash that made both men flinch. He began pacing the small office like a caged animal, running his hands through his graying hair in a gesture that spoke of panic, barely held in check. "You have to walk away," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Right now. Today. Forget you ever saw it. Forget you ever heard the name Coldstream. And pray to whatever God you believe in that they haven't already figured out what you found." Why? Because the people who terminated Coldstream are still alive. Marcus. Still in positions of power. Still connected to networks that span the globe. And they didn't let $200 million disappear because they forgot about it or stopped caring. They let it disappear because anyone who got close to it died. And they were patient enough to wait for the right moment to retrieve it safely. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came before panic attacks. But he forced himself to breathe slowly and focus on what Tommy was telling him rather than what it meant for his future. Then why hasn't anyone found it in 43 years? Tommy stopped pacing and turned to face him with an expression that mixed fear and something that might have been admiration. Because it was hidden somewhere, no one would think to look. Somewhere the paper trail led to a dead end, and the property was legally tied up in bureaucratic red tape that could last forever. He paused, his face growing pale. What kind of building did you buy? Abandoned airport terminal. Been closed since '79. Tommy sank back into his chair as if his legs had given out completely. Millbrook Regional. Dear God in heaven. That was one of the primary transfer points. I flew in and out of there a dozen times during my involvement with the program. You knew about it. We all thought it was just operational cover. A place to refuel aircraft and change crews without attracting attention from civilian aviation authorities. But if they hid the operational funds there... Tommy trailed off, then suddenly grabbed Marcus by the shoulders with surprising strength. You need to listen to me very carefully. The people who ran Coldstream weren't just government officials following orders. They had connections to organized crime, foreign intelligence services, corporate interests that spanned multiple continents and crossed every boundary you can imagine. The money you found isn't just cash. It's evidence of every dirty deal they made for 5 years. All the more reason to expose it and let the truth come out. All the more reason for them to kill you before you can say a word to anyone who matters. As if summoned by their conversation about surveillance and danger, Tommy's office phone rang with the sharp electronic tone that always seemed too loud in quiet moments. He looked at the caller ID display and frowned in a way that made Marcus's stomach clench with anticipation of bad news. Unknown number, Tommy said. Could be anyone, but timing makes me nervous. He answered anyway, his voice carefully neutral. Veterans Center, Tommy speaking. Veterans. 5 neutral. Marcus watched Tommy's face go white as he listened to whoever was on the other end of the line. The conversation was brief and one-sided, with Tommy saying little more than yes and I understand and no comment, before hanging up with hands that trembled slightly. That was someone claiming to be from the Department of Veterans Affairs Audit Department, Tommy said, his voice hollow with shock. They wanted to know if I'd had any recent conversations about historical military operations. Specifically mentioned Project Coldstream by name. Marcus felt his stomach drop like an elevator with cut cables. That was fast. Too fast. Tommy agreed grimly. Marcus, they're already watching. They probably started monitoring communications the moment you opened that sealed room. Modern surveillance technology can detect conversations about specific topics, track vehicle movements, monitor financial transactions. If they wanted to know when someone found their hidden assets, they'd have systems in place to alert them immediately. How could they know? Tommy pointed to a corner of the ceiling where a small device Marcus hadn't noticed was blinking with a tiny red light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with their heartbeats. Because they never really left. The operation was terminated, but the oversight continued. They just went underground and waited. The rest of the day passed in a blur of paranoid preparation and growing awareness that Marcus had stumbled into something far more dangerous than he'd initially understood. Tommy helped him grasp the basics of operational security. How to communicate without being monitored. How to move without being tracked. How to act normal when you knew people were watching your every move and analyzing your every decision. But it was already too late for complete secrecy. As Marcus drove back toward the terminal that evening, taking a circuitous route through backroads that should have been empty, he noticed the same dark sedan in his rearview mirror for the third time in 2 hours. When he pulled into a gas station to test his suspicions, the sedan drove past without slowing. But Marcus caught a clear glimpse of the driver, a man in an expensive suit, wearing sunglasses despite the late hour and overcast sky. Professional surveillance. The kind that wanted to be noticed just enough to send a message without being so obvious as to constitute evidence of harassment. Back at the terminal, Marcus felt the weight of invisible eyes as he made his way through the building's shadowy corridors. Someone had been there in his absence. He was certain of it. Nothing was disturbed, nothing was missing. But the fine layer of dust he'd noticed that morning had been disrupted by footprints that weren't his own. The kind of careful search that left everything in place while documenting everything that mattered. In the control room, everything appeared exactly as he'd left it, but Marcus's combat-trained instincts told him otherwise. Someone had been through the files with professional thoroughness, had photographed the money with equipment sophisticated enough to capture serial numbers, and identifying marks, had catalogued exactly what he'd found, and probably transmitted that information to people who were deciding what to do about the situation. They knew what he knew, and they were evaluating their options. That night, Marcus set up a simple perimeter alert system using fishing line and empty cans, a trick he'd learned during his second deployment when conventional security equipment wasn't available. If anyone approached the building during the night, he'd hear them coming in time to either hide or defend himself, depending on their intentions. Then he settled down with the files again, determined to understand what he was facing before they decided how to handle his inconvenient discovery. What he learned over the next several hours made him wish he'd listened to Tommy's advice about walking away while he still could. According to the documents, Project Coldstream had been far more than just a money laundering operation, or even a comprehensive intelligence program. It had been a systematic effort to place American assets and influence in positions where they could shape global events for decades into the future. The money was just the fuel that powered a much larger machine designed to manipulate elections, destabilize governments, redirect natural resources, and eliminate obstacles to American corporate and political interests worldwide. The terminal had been one of dozens of facilities around the world, but it had been special in ways that made Marcus's blood run cold as he read about its intended purpose. It wasn't just a transfer point for money and personnel. It was where the operations architects had planned to retreat if their activities were exposed by congressional investigation or foreign intelligence services. The sealed room wasn't just a safe or storage facility. It was a panic room designed to sustain a small group of people for months, while their associates in government and corporate leadership cleaned up any evidence of their existence. But something had gone catastrophically wrong. The files suggested internal betrayal on a scale that had threatened not just the operation but the careers and lives of everyone involved. Someone had been selling information to foreign governments, someone with access to the highest levels of operational security, someone who'd been trusted with secrets that could destroy administrations and topple governments. The operation had been terminated not by enemy action or congressional oversight, but by internal conspiracy and the kind of paranoia that comes when people realize their most trusted associates might be plotting their destruction. And the person who'd betrayed them, the seventh member of the inner circle who'd disappeared with millions in operational funds, had hidden far more than cash in the terminal. In a folder Marcus had initially overlooked, he found photographs and documents that revealed the scope of Coldstream's ongoing influence in ways that made him understand why powerful people might be willing to kill to keep these secrets buried. Current senators whose careers had been launched with Coldstream funding. Federal judges whose appointments had been orchestrated by Coldstream connected political networks. Military officials whose promotions had been guided by assessments of their willingness to cooperate with extra-legal operations. Corporate leaders whose companies had grown from small contractors into multinational conglomerates through preferential treatment and inside information. Coldstream hadn't ended in 1979. It had evolved, adapted, gone legitimate, while maintaining the same basic objectives through legal channels and official procedures. The people who'd built it had simply found better ways to achieve their goals without the risk that came from operating outside the law. The money in the terminal wasn't abandoned operational funds. It was insurance, a guarantee that the original architects could disappear and start over if their legal successors ever threatened to expose them or cut them out of ongoing operations. And now Marcus had found it, along with documentation that could connect current officials to 40 years of systematic corruption and illegal activity. His fishing line perimeter alarm chimed softly just after midnight, the gentle sound of empty cans touching together in a way that spoke of careful movement rather than wind or animals. Marcus extinguished his flashlight immediately and moved to the window he'd prepared earlier, peering through a gap in the boards he'd placed to block the view from outside. 3 vehicles were approaching the terminal through the forest, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights probing for targets. They weren't trying to hide their approach or move with any kind of stealth. They wanted him to know they were coming, wanted him to have time to think about what their arrival might mean. This was a demonstration of power, not an attempt at surprise. Marcus had perhaps 5 minutes before they reached the building, time enough to grab the most damaging documents from the files and stuff them into the waterproof bag he'd prepared for exactly this situation, along with several bundles of cash and some of the smaller gold pieces that might serve as evidence or bargaining chips, depending on how the conversation went. The rest of the fortune would have to stay in place while he hoped these people were here to negotiate rather than eliminate evidence and witnesses. He made his way to the hiding spot he'd identified earlier, a maintenance space behind the control room that was accessible through a panel designed to look like part of the wall. If they were here to kill him, he wanted them to have to work for it. If they were here to negotiate, he wanted the conversation to happen on terms that gave him some small advantage. The sound of engines grew louder as they approached through the forest, then stopped abruptly as the vehicles reached the terminal's parking area. Car doors slammed with the precise timing that spoke of coordinated movement by people who'd worked together before. Footsteps on concrete, multiple sets, moving with military precision. Voices too low to distinguish individual words, but clear enough to reveal coordination and purpose. Professional operators who knew their business. Light blazed through the terminal as whoever was outside set up portable illumination equipment powerful enough to turn night into day. Marcus heard equipment being moved, orders being given in the kind of calm, efficient tones that suggested these people had done this type of operation many times before. Then a voice called out, amplified by electronic equipment and echoing through the empty building with the kind of authority that expected to be obeyed. "Mr. Rivera, we know you're here. We're not here to harm you or threaten your safety in any way. We're here to discuss a business proposition that could benefit everyone involved in this situation." Marcus said nothing, barely breathing in his hiding place while trying to gauge how many people were involved and what kind of equipment they'd brought. "We know what you've found, and we know you're intelligent enough to understand what it means," the voice continued with the patient tone of someone accustomed to dealing with frightened people who needed reassurance. "You're also smart enough to know that you can't use this information or these assets alone. But with the right partners, with the right approach and proper support, Everyone could walk away from this situation substantially improved. The light outside his hiding place dimmed as someone entered the control room itself. Marcus could see shadows moving across the walls, hear the soft sounds of equipment being set up and photographs being taken. "We're going to leave some materials for you to review at your own pace," the voice said. Closer now. Definitely coming from inside the control room, where millions of dollars sat in plain sight. "Take your time to consider your options carefully. But remember that silence is only golden when everyone benefits from it, and cooperation is always more profitable than confrontation." Footsteps retreated with the same precision they'd arrived. Equipment was packed up, efficiently and quietly. Engines started and faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence that felt somehow more oppressive than the noise had been. Marcus waited another hour before emerging from his hiding space, using the time to listen for any sounds that might indicate someone had stayed behind to monitor his movements. When he finally stepped back into the control room, everything looked exactly as he'd left it, but there was one new addition sitting in the center of the table like a spider in its web. A briefcase, expensive leather with brass fittings, positioned precisely where he couldn't miss it when he returned. Inside the briefcase, Marcus found documents that made his hands shake as he read through them by flashlight. Bank account numbers for accounts that had been opened in his name at institutions he'd never heard of. Property deeds for real estate in locations around the country that he'd never visited. Investment portfolios containing stocks and bonds worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. All in his name, all legal and properly documented, all containing amounts that would ensure he'd never have to worry about money again. Never have to struggle with rent payments or grocery bills, or the 1,000 small humiliations that came with poverty. All he had to do was sign the papers at the bottom of each document, officially transfer ownership of the terminal and its contents back to a corporate shell entity whose ownership was buried in layers of legal complexity, and walk away with enough wealth to live comfortably for the rest of his life. But at the very bottom of the briefcase, underneath all the legal documents and financial incentives, was a photograph that made his blood freeze in his veins like ice water. It was Tommy Costa, sitting at his desk in the Veterans Center earlier that day, talking on the phone with an expression of growing alarm on his weathered face. The photo had been taken through the window from outside the building, capturing the exact moment when Tommy had received the call about Project Coldstream. Written on the back in neat, careful handwriting was a simple message that carried the weight of absolute certainty. Some conversations are more expensive than others. Marcus set the photograph down with fingers that trembled despite his efforts to remain calm. They'd been watching him longer than he'd realized, monitoring his movements and documenting his contacts with the kind of thoroughness that spoke of unlimited resources and patient planning. They knew about Tommy, about their conversation, about everyone Marcus might have told about his discovery. The offer in the briefcase wasn't just a business proposition designed to solve an inconvenient problem. It was a threat wrapped in money, a choice between personal wealth and the lives of people he cared about, a demonstration that they had the power to reach anyone, anywhere, at any time they chose. What happens next will force Marcus to choose between saving himself and saving the truth, between accepting the easy fortune they're offering and fighting the dangerous battle he knows is right. His decision will determine not just his fate, but the fate of everyone who's ever been betrayed by the system they served. If you're enjoying this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more incredible true stories. Marcus closed the briefcase and leaned back in the chair, staring at the stacks of money that surrounded him like silent witnesses to decades of corruption and betrayal. For 43 years, this fortune had been hidden in this room, waiting for someone desperate enough or brave enough to claim it. Now he understood why it had stayed hidden for so long, why no one had ever come forward with evidence of Project Coldstream or the systematic abuse of power it represented. Because claiming it meant joining a conspiracy that had no visible end, or fighting a war against people with unlimited resources, and the patience to wait decades for the perfect moment to strike. Because the price of the truth was higher than most people could afford to pay, and the people who controlled the system had spent 40 years perfecting ways to ensure that inconvenient discoveries led to convenient accidents. But as Marcus looked at that photograph of Tommy, as he thought about all the veterans he'd known who'd been chewed up and spit out by a system that viewed them as disposable assets rather than human beings deserving of respect and care, he realized something that surprised him with its clarity. He wasn't alone. Not if he didn't choose to be. The people who'd hidden this money, who'd built their careers on secrecy and intimidation, had spent decades believing that ordinary people could be bought or frightened into silence. They'd never encountered someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for, someone who understood that some truths were worth dying for, and some fights were worth having, even when you knew you couldn't win. Marcus had found more than money in that sealed room. He'd found evidence of a conspiracy that had shaped American policy and global events for decades. Evidence that could expose the truth and change everything if it reached the right people in the right way. And tomorrow, despite the risks and the threats and the overwhelming odds against success, he was going to start building an army of people who'd been waiting their whole lives for the chance to fight back against a system that had betrayed them. The war for truth and accountability was about to begin, and Marcus Rivera was no longer just a broken veteran trying to survive. He was a man with a mission that could change the world. Marcus didn't sign the papers. Instead, he spent the next 3 days doing something the conspirators behind Project Coldstream had never expected. He started making copies of everything. Every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence in that control room was duplicated using a combination of his phone's camera, a scanner he bought with cash 2 counties away, and old-fashioned photocopying at libraries scattered across 3 states. He stored the duplicates in safety deposit boxes registered under names that wouldn't connect to him. Mail drops managed by people who owed favors to people who owed him favors, and with individuals who had no apparent connection to him but shared one crucial characteristic. They'd all been betrayed by the same system that had abandoned him. By Thursday morning, Marcus had built a network of insurance policies that would make his death more dangerous to the conspiracy than his continued existence. But insurance wasn't enough anymore. He needed allies, and he knew exactly where to find them. The American Legion post in Millbrook occupied a building that had seen better decades and better funding. The paint was peeling in strips that curled like old skin. The roof leaked during every storm, and the heating system worked only when the wind was blowing from the right direction, and someone remembered to bang on the furnace with a wrench. But on Thursday nights, it filled with men and women who'd served their country with distinction and been quietly discarded when their usefulness ended, when the politicians who'd sent them to war decided it was cheaper to forget them than to fix them. Marcus had never been comfortable in groups larger than a fire team. But tonight, he forced himself through the front door and into a room full of people who understood nightmares that followed you home, phantom pain that doctors couldn't treat, and the peculiar loneliness that came with having survived things that couldn't be explained to people who hadn't been there. Tommy Costa was there, of course. Along with Frank, the older veteran who'd fled when Marcus first mentioned Coldstream at the Veterans Center. But there were others Marcus recognized from around town. Faces he'd seen at the grocery store or gas station, people who'd nodded at him with the subtle acknowledgement that passed between those who'd worn the uniform and carried the weight. Sarah McKenna sat near the back, her left sleeve pinned up where her arm should have been, lost to an improvised explosive device outside Fallujah that had also taken 2 members of her squad and left her with survivor's guilt that manifested as a determination to help other veterans navigate the bureaucratic maze that passed for support services. She worked nights as a dispatcher for the county sheriff's office, a job that let her use her military communications training while avoiding the crowds and chaos that made her chest tight with anxiety. Jim Torres was there too, hunched over a cup of coffee that had probably been brewing since the Carter administration. His convoy had been ambushed in the mountains outside Kabul, and he'd spent 3 days pinned down in a disabled Humvee while insurgents used his position for target practice. The rescue had come eventually, but not before he'd watched his best friend bleed out in the seat next to him while he was powerless to help. These days, he drove long-haul truck routes that kept him moving and alone. Earning just enough to pay rent on a studio apartment, he used mainly for storing the belongings he couldn't fit in his cab. Maria Santos sat by herself near the pool table, still wearing the scrubs from her job at the VA Medical Center, where she worked as a nurse practitioner. She'd been a Navy corpsman in Iraq and Afghanistan, had seen too much death in too many places, and spoke only when she had something important to say. Her colleagues at the hospital respected her clinical skills, but found her intensity unsettling, the way she looked at patients as if she could see through their skin to the damage underneath. Marcus approached Tommy, who looked like he'd been expecting this conversation since their meeting at the Veterans Center. The older man's face carried the weight of someone who'd spent days wrestling with decisions that had no good outcomes. "You look like a man who's made a choice," Tommy said without preamble. "I have," Marcus replied. "I'm not walking away from this." Tommy sighed deeply, the sound carrying decades of disappointment with systems that promised much and delivered little. "Then, you're going to need more help than I can give you alone. That's why I'm here." Tommy looked around the room at the assembled veterans. Men and women who'd given everything to serve their country and received bureaucratic indifference in return. These people have been through enough already. Don't drag them into something that could get them killed just because you can't let sleeping dogs lie. "They're already being killed," Marcus replied, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised him with its strength. "Just slowly, quietly, by a system that treats them like they don't matter, like their sacrifice was just the cost of doing business. Maybe it's time to give them a chance to fight something that can actually be defeated." Frank had been listening from a nearby table where he'd been pretending to read a magazine that was older than some of the wars they'd all fought. He stood with the careful movements of someone whose joints carried the accumulated damage of decades of hard living, and walked over with a deliberation that suggested he'd been preparing for this moment longer than anyone realized. "You still got those documents you mentioned?" Frank asked quietly, his voice carrying undertones that suggested the question was more loaded than it appeared. Marcus nodded. "Among other things that would interest you." Frank was quiet for a moment, weighing risks and possibilities with the methodical care of someone who'd learned that hasty decisions could have permanent consequences. Finally, he made a choice that seemed to surprise even him. "I was more than briefly involved with Project Coldstream," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the sudden quiet that had fallen over their corner of the room. I was the communications specialist who first discovered that operational funds were being systematically diverted from their authorized purposes. The conversation around them gradually quieted as other veterans sensed something important happening. The kind of shift in atmosphere that preceded mission briefings or casualty reports. When I tried to report the discrepancies through proper channels, Frank continued, his voice growing stronger as he committed to the revelation. I was told to forget what I'd seen, transfer to a desk job in Germany, and keep my mouth shut if I wanted to keep my pension and security clearance. But you lived, Marcus said, stating the obvious but recognizing its significance. Because I ran like a coward, Frank replied with bitter honesty. Changed my name, disappeared into the bureaucracy, spent 40 years looking over my shoulder and jumping at shadows. But I kept copies of everything. Communications, records, financial transfers, personnel files. I've been waiting 4 decades for someone to give them to. Someone who might actually do something with them, besides file them away and forget they existed. Maria Santos had been listening from across the room with the focused attention she brought to everything that might matter. She approached with the careful steps of someone who'd learned to evaluate threats quickly and thoroughly, her dark eyes taking in details most people would miss. "What kind of money are we talking about?" she asked, her voice carrying the practical concern of someone who'd learned that resources determined what was possible. Marcus met her gaze without flinching. Enough to fund every veteran program in this state for the next 50 years. Enough to ensure that no veteran ever has to choose between medication and rent, between therapy and groceries, and the cost of claiming it, taking on people who've been eliminating inconvenient witnesses for 4 decades. People with unlimited resources, government connections, and the kind of patience that can wait decades for the perfect moment to strike. Maria smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression that reminded Marcus why corpsmen had been among the most feared and respected members of any unit. Finally, a mission that actually matters. Over the next hour, word spread through the Legion post with the efficiency of a military communication network that had been refined through decades of shared struggle and mutual dependence. Veterans who'd been fighting individual battles against a bureaucracy that seemed designed to wear them down suddenly found themselves part of something that could change the fundamental equation. But they weren't naive about what they were facing. These were people who'd seen combat, who understood that wars weren't won by good intentions, but by superior intelligence, better planning, and the willingness to accept losses in service of objectives that mattered more than individual survival. Sarah McKenna, despite the loss of her arm, turned out to be a cybersecurity expert who'd been working dead-end technical support jobs because no one wanted to hire a disabled veteran for positions that required security clearances. Within minutes of hearing Marcus's story, she was sketching plans for digital security that would make their communications invisible to government surveillance systems, while ensuring that critical information would survive even if they didn't. Jim Torres had spent his civilian years driving truck routes that covered 6 states, learning highway networks and back roads that wouldn't appear on any official monitoring system. He could move people and materials through routes that existed in the gaps between official oversight. The kind of knowledge that came from years of avoiding way stations and traffic enforcement. Maria Santos had connections throughout the VA medical system. Nurses, doctors, administrators who'd watched veteran after veteran die from treatable conditions, while bureaucrats argued about funding allocations and eligibility requirements. People who'd taken an oath to do no harm and watched their government systematically violate that principle. And Frank, Quiet Frank, who'd spent 4 decades looking over his shoulder and expecting retribution that never came, produced a go-bag from his truck that contained enough evidence to connect Project Coldstream to current government officials in ways that would destroy careers, topple administrations, and rewrite the history of American foreign policy. "Question is," Tommy said as the group gathered around a table that had become an impromptu command center, "what's the end game? We can't just expose this information and hope the system investigates itself honestly. We need leverage that can't be ignored or buried." Marcus pulled out his phone and showed them photographs of the control room, the stacks of money, the documents that revealed ongoing corruption at levels that reached into the current government. "The end game is choice," he said. "We offer them the same deal they offered me, but in reverse. They can transfer every penny of that money to legitimate veteran programs, publicly admit to the existence and scope of Project Coldstream, and accept whatever legal consequences come from full disclosure. And if they refuse, then we release everything simultaneously to every major newspaper, television network, and online platform in the country, along with detailed instructions on where interested parties can find the physical evidence to verify everything we're claiming." Sarah looked up from the cybersecurity plans she'd been sketching on the back of a napkin. "You realize they'll try to kill us all before they let that information become public?" "They'll try," Marcus agreed. "But they'll have to find us first. And they'll have to do it before our dead man's switches activate and release everything automatically if we fail to check in according to predetermined schedules." Frank laughed, a sound with more admiration than humor. 40 years I've been running from these people, hiding in plain sight and praying they'd forgotten about me. Never occurred to me to make them run from me. Instead. Number time. The planning session lasted until nearly dawn, fueled by coffee that could strip paint and the kind of energy that came from finally having a mission that mattered. By the time the veterans dispersed, they'd created a communication network that couldn't be easily monitored, established secure storage locations for evidence throughout the region, and developed contingency plans for scenarios ranging from negotiated settlement to full-scale information warfare. But most importantly, they'd given each other something none of them had possessed in years: purpose that extended beyond mere survival. Marcus returned to the terminal as the sun was rising. But he wasn't alone anymore. Sarah had installed encrypted communication devices throughout the building that would alert the network if anyone approached or entered the facility. Jim had mapped 3 separate evacuation routes that wouldn't be visible to aerial surveillance or satellite tracking. Frank had hidden additional copies of his evidence in locations that would survive, even if the terminal itself was destroyed by people who preferred to eliminate problems rather than solve them. The control room no longer felt like a tomb filled with secrets waiting to be discovered. It felt like a command center for an operation that could change everything. That evening, Marcus received a phone call on the same number the mysterious voice had used before. "Mr. Rivera." The voice was familiar but carried new undertones of concern that suggested the game had changed. "I trust you've had adequate time to consider our generous offer." "I have," Marcus replied. "I'd like to make a counteroffer that I think you'll find interesting." Silence stretched across the connection, the kind of pause that suggested rapid consultation with people who weren't part of the conversation but were listening to every word. "I'm listening," the voice finally said. $200 million transferred to veteran rehabilitation programs over the next 5 years. Full disclosure of Project Coldstream's activities, both historical and ongoing. Congressional hearings with guaranteed immunity for witnesses and unlimited access to classified materials. That's quite ambitious for someone in your position. It's also non-negotiable. Another pause. Longer this time. And if we decline your counteroffer, then tomorrow morning, every major news organization in the country receives a comprehensive package of documents, photographs, and financial records, along with detailed maps showing exactly where interested investigators can find additional evidence to verify everything we're claiming. Mr. Rivera, I don't think you fully understand the scope of what you're threatening to disrupt. The systems we've built serve purposes larger than your personal grievances. I understand perfectly, Marcus replied with a conviction that surprised him. The question is whether you understand that I'm no longer someone you can buy or intimidate. I've got nothing to lose, and 43 years of injustice to correct. You're not working alone. It wasn't a question. The voice carried the certainty of people who had access to surveillance capabilities Marcus could only imagine. Marcus smiled, thinking about the network of veterans who'd found purpose in something larger than their individual struggles. Neither are you. The difference is, my allies aren't afraid of dying for something that matters. The call ended without further conversation. But Marcus knew he'd just declared war on people who'd been winning through violence and secrecy for decades. Within hours, the counterattack began with the systematic precision he'd expected. Sarah's communication devices started detecting unusual network activity, probing attacks designed to penetrate their security and identify their locations. Jim Spotters, a network of truck drivers and highway workers he'd cultivated over years of long-haul routes, reported unmarked vehicles positioning themselves on roads leading to the terminal and other locations connected to their operation. Frank's contacts within the government, people who owed him favors or shared his concerns about systematic corruption, began reporting pressure to transfer away from sensitive positions, retire early, or take extended leave for health reasons that materialized suddenly and conveniently. But the veterans had anticipated this response. Instead of retreating into defensive positions, they accelerated their timeline and launched the kind of coordinated offensive that utilized every skill they'd learned in military service. By midnight, packages were being delivered to news organizations across the country by couriers who couldn't be traced back to their sources. Not the full evidence that would remain in reserve as leverage, but enough documentation to establish that Project Coldstream had existed, that it had involved current government officials in systematic corruption, and that a full investigation would reveal crimes that reached into the highest levels of power. The story broke simultaneously on 3 networks Friday morning, time to hit the news cycle when maximum audience would be available, and government officials would be caught off guard by the coordination of the release. By noon, congressional offices were flooded with calls demanding immediate hearings and investigations. By evening, the FBI had announced a formal investigation into allegations concerning historical intelligence operations and potential ongoing criminal activity. But the conspirators' response was swift and predictable. Frank's truck exploded in a gas station parking lot due to what investigators would later determine was a convenient leak in the fuel system. Sarah's apartment was burglarized by thieves who seemed more interested in her computer equipment than her jewelry or other valuables. Jim received official notice that his commercial driver's license was under review for possible irregularities that would prevent him from working while the investigation proceeded. The message was clear: surrender the evidence and abandon the investigation, or watch everyone you care about be destroyed systematically through methods that would appear legal and coincidental. Marcus was driving back to the terminal Friday night when he noticed the helicopter following him at a distance that maintained plausible deniability while making its presence obvious. It stayed just far enough away to avoid being clearly identified, while remaining close enough that its surveillance was unmistakable. As he pulled into the terminal's overgrown parking area, the helicopter circled once, in a pattern that seemed almost casual, then disappeared into the night sky like a mechanical ghost. Inside the control room, Marcus found that someone had left another briefcase, this one containing photographs that made his blood run cold, despite everything he'd already experienced. Pictures of Tommy at the Veterans Center, taken through windows with telephoto lenses. Sarah at her job, captured during what should have been secure moments. Jim, at a truck stop, photographed, while he thought he was alone. Maria leaving the hospital where she worked, her movement tracked with the precision of professional surveillance. All of them had red X's marked across their faces with what appeared to be fresh ink. The accompanying note was brief, but carried the weight of absolute certainty. 48 hours to reconsider our offer. No further extensions will be granted. Marcus stared at the photographs for a long time, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket that threatened to crush him under its accumulated mass. He'd been prepared to risk his own life for the truth, but risking the lives of people who'd trusted him with their safety was something else entirely. He was reaching for his phone to call Tommy when it rang in his hands with the sharp electronic tone that always seemed too loud in quiet moments. "Don't even think about backing down now." Maria's voice was calm and determined, carrying the authority of someone who'd made life and death decisions under pressure. "We've all seen the photos. We all know exactly what we signed up for when we agreed to join this fight. Maria, they're going to. My 6C. Maria, 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 they're going to. They're going to try to do what they've been doing to us our whole adult lives." She interrupted with the kind of controlled anger that came from years of watching good people suffer while bad people prospered. "Divide us, isolate us, make us feel powerless and alone. But here's the thing, Marcus. For the first time in my adult life, I'm not powerless. None of us are." Over the next hour, Marcus received similar calls from every member of their group. Not one of them was willing to back down, even facing direct threats to their lives and the lives of people they cared about. But they weren't relying on courage alone to see them through what was coming. While the conspirators had been focusing on intimidation and traditional pressure tactics, the veterans had been building something that couldn't be destroyed by conventional means. A network of witnesses, evidence, caches, and automatic release mechanisms that would ensure the truth survived even if none of them did. More importantly, they'd been reaching out to other veteran groups, other victims of government betrayal, other people who'd been waiting their entire lives for the chance to fight back against a system that viewed them as expendable assets rather than human beings deserving of respect and consideration. By Saturday morning, the small group of veterans from the Millbrook Legion Post had become the center of a nationwide network of people who'd been systematically ignored, cheated, and discarded by the same institutions they'd sworn to serve and protect. The story was no longer about $200 million hidden in an airport terminal, or even about a Cold War conspiracy that had outlived its original purpose. It had become about 40 years of systematic betrayal, and the people who were finally in a position to demand accountability from those who'd believed themselves untouchable. The conspirators behind Project Coldstream had spent decades believing that ordinary people could be controlled through fear, intimidation, and the manipulation of systems they didn't understand or couldn't navigate effectively. They were about to learn that they'd fundamentally underestimated the power of people who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The weekend brought a development none of them had anticipated. Support began materializing from unexpected sources. Investigative journalists who'd been waiting years for a story with this kind of scope and documentation. Congressional staff members who'd been quietly compiling evidence of systematic corruption. Federal agents who'd grown tired of watching obvious crimes go unprosecuted due to political pressure. By Sunday evening, what had started as a desperate gamble by a small group of forgotten veterans had become a nationwide movement that could no longer be contained through traditional means of pressure and intimidation. The truth had found its voice, and it was about to become too loud for anyone to ignore. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Monday morning brought vindication in ways that exceeded their most optimistic projections. 3 major newspapers published detailed exposés based on the documentation they'd provided, complete with verification by independent experts and corroboration by additional sources who'd remained silent for decades. Congressional leaders announced immediate hearings with subpoena power and unlimited access to classified materials. But most importantly, the FBI raid that arrived at the terminal wasn't coming to suppress evidence or intimidate witnesses. It was coming to secure and catalog what had become the most significant intelligence finding in decades. Evidence that would reshape understanding of American government operations and foreign policy for the past 40 years. Marcus met the federal agents at the terminal's front entrance, accompanied by Tommy Costa, Sarah McKenna, and a lawyer named Patricia Williams, who specialized in whistleblower protection and had volunteered her services the moment the story broke. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, who led the FBI team, was professional but clearly overwhelmed by the scope of what she was facing and the implications of what they were about to uncover. "Mr. Rivera," she said, "I need to advise you that this is now an official federal investigation with implications for national security and ongoing criminal proceedings. Anything you show us will become evidence in what may be the largest government corruption case in American history." "That's what we've been hoping for since this started," Marcus replied. Agent Walsh studied him for a moment with eyes that had seen enough corruption to recognize the real thing when it appeared. "In 30 years with the Bureau, I've never encountered anything approaching this scale. The amount of corroborating evidence, the systematic nature of the conspiracy, the duration of the cover-up. It's going to take years just to catalog everything you've uncovered." "Will it be enough?" Patricia Williams asked. "Enough for prosecutions that will actually stick?" Walsh nodded slowly. "If half of what we've seen so far holds up to official scrutiny, we're looking at RICO charges, conspiracy charges, fraud, embezzlement, and possibly treason. This investigation is going to reach into every level of government and reshape how we understand the past 4 decades of American policy." She paused, looking at Marcus with something that might have been respect mixed with concern. "But you need to understand that you've also painted targets on your backs that will never completely disappear. There are going to be people in very powerful positions who view your continued existence as an existential threat to their freedom and way of life." "Agent Walsh," Tommy said, "we've been living with targets on our backs our whole adult lives, just for wearing the uniform and believing the promises they made when we enlisted. At least now we're shooting back." The formal evidence transfer took 8 hours and required 3 trucks to transport everything they'd found in the terminal. But the real treasure, the network of people who'd been awakened to their own power, couldn't be loaded onto evidence trucks or filed away in government warehouses. The conspirators behind Project Coldstream had spent decades building a system based on the assumption that ordinary people would remain silent when confronted with power they couldn't challenge. They'd never imagined facing people who understood that some truths were worth dying for, and some fights were worth having even when victory seemed impossible. Marcus Rivera had bought an abandoned airport terminal for $800, thinking he was purchasing a place to hide from the world. Instead, he'd found the courage to change it, one carefully planned operation at a time. The war for accountability was far from over. But the first major victory belonged to people who'd been forgotten by everyone except each other. The showdown came on a Tuesday morning in March, almost exactly 44 years after Project Coldstream had been officially terminated in the same season 4 decades earlier. Marcus woke in the terminal to the sound of helicopters, not 1 or 2, but what sounded like an entire squadron approaching through the mountain valleys with the steady rhythm of mechanical thunder. But these weren't black helicopters carrying mysterious operatives or government agents sent to suppress inconvenient truths. These were media choppers, news crews racing to cover the story that had exploded across every major network and newspaper in the country over the weekend, transforming from a regional curiosity into a national scandal that reached into the highest levels of power. The veterans' strategy of gradual disclosure had worked better than anyone had dared hope. Rather than releasing everything at once, which could have been dismissed as conspiracy theory or buried in bureaucratic procedures designed to make problems disappear, they'd parceled out information in carefully timed releases that built credibility and momentum like an avalanche gathering force. As it descended, first had come Frank's communications records, proving beyond doubt that Project Coldstream had existed and had involved people who were still alive, still influential, still in positions where they could shape policy and control investigations. Then Sarah's cybersecurity analysis, showing how the conspiracy had evolved into legitimate-seeming corporate and political networks that operated in plain sight while maintaining their original objectives. Then Maria's medical records and testimony, documenting how veteran healthcare had been deliberately undermined through policies designed to reduce long-term costs by ensuring that inconvenient claimants died or gave up before receiving the care they'd earned through service and sacrifice. Each revelation had been supported by physical evidence that couldn't be dismissed, verified by independent experts who had no connection to the veterans or their cause, and corroborated by additional witnesses who'd been waiting decades for someone to listen to their stories and take their experiences seriously. By Sunday night, the political earthquake had begun in earnest. 3 senators had announced their immediate retirement from public service, citing the need to pursue other interests, while their offices were searched by FBI agents with warrants that covered decades of financial records. 2 federal judges had recused themselves from all pending cases after documents surfaced, showing their appointments had been orchestrated by Coldstream-connected political networks. The Director of Veterans Affairs had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation into systematic fraud that stretched back to the program's inception. And the FBI raid arriving at the terminal wasn't coming to suppress evidence or intimidate witnesses into silence. It was coming to secure and catalog what had become the most significant intelligence finding since the Pentagon Papers. Evidence that would reshape understanding of American government operations for the past 4 decades. Marcus met the federal agents at the terminal's front entrance, accompanied by Tommy Costa, Sarah McKenna, and Patricia Williams, the whistleblower protection attorney, who'd volunteered her services the moment the story broke and had since become their primary interface with law enforcement and congressional investigators. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, who led the FBI team, was professional but clearly overwhelmed by the scope of what she was facing and the implications of what they were about to uncover in that sealed room. "Mr. Rivera," she said, adjusting her jacket against the mountain wind, "I need to advise you that this is now an official federal investigation with implications for national security and ongoing criminal proceedings. Anything you show us will become evidence in what may be the largest government corruption case in American history." "That's exactly what we've been hoping for since this started," Marcus replied, feeling a calm that surprised him with its completeness. Agent Walsh studied him for a moment, with eyes that had seen enough corruption in her 30-year career to recognize authentic integrity when it appeared. "In 3 decades with the Bureau, I've never encountered anything approaching this scale. The amount of corroborating evidence, the systematic nature of the conspiracy, the duration of the cover-up. It's going to take years just to catalog everything you've uncovered and trace all the connections." "Will it be enough?" Patricia Williams asked, with the focused concern of someone who'd spent her career watching powerful people escape consequences through legal technicalities. "Enough for prosecutions that will actually stick and produce real accountability?" Walsh nodded slowly, her expression mixing professional satisfaction with something that might have been hope. "If half of what we've verified so far holds up to official scrutiny, we're looking at RICO charges, conspiracy charges, fraud, embezzlement, and possibly treason. This investigation is going to reach into every level of government and reshape how we understand the past 4 decades of American policy, both foreign and domestic." She paused, looking at Marcus with something that definitely qualified as respect. "But you need to understand that you've also painted targets on your backs that will never completely disappear. There are going to be people in very powerful positions who view your continued existence as an existential threat to their freedom and way of life." "Agent Walsh," Tommy said with the dry humor that had sustained him through decades of bureaucratic battles, "we've been living with targets on our backs our whole adult lives, just for wearing the uniform and believing the promises they made when we enlisted. At least now, we're shooting back with something more effective than complaints and benefit claims." The formal evidence transfer took 8 hours and required 3 separate trucks to transport everything they'd found in the terminal. FBI specialists photographed, catalogued, and removed every document, every piece of currency, every gold coin and bearer bond that Marcus had discovered in that pristine control room. Teams of forensic accountants worked alongside digital specialists to ensure that nothing was lost or overlooked in the process of converting a hidden fortune into legal evidence. But the real treasure, the network of people who'd been awakened to their own power, and the possibilities that came with collective action, couldn't be loaded onto evidence trucks or filed away in government warehouses. Over the following weeks, as congressional hearings began and grand juries were impaneled in multiple jurisdictions, the story continued to grow beyond anything the original conspirators had imagined possible. Veterans groups across the country started their own investigations into suspicious activities, mysterious funding sources, and officials who'd promised much while delivering little. What had begun as one man's desperate discovery had become a nationwide reckoning with decades of systematic betrayal. The $200 million from the terminal was indeed transferred to veteran programs as part of the legal settlement negotiated by teams of prosecutors and defense attorneys but by then it represented only a small fraction of the money that investigations were uncovering. Decades of skimmed funds, diverted appropriations, and fraudulent contracts were being exposed and recovered through a process that seemed to reveal new crimes with every passing day. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the transformation of people who'd been trained to follow orders and accept whatever treatment they received into citizens who demanded accountability from those who claimed to serve them. Marcus found himself testifying before Congress on a Thursday in May, sitting at a witness table, facing senators and representatives who seemed genuinely shocked by the scope of what had been hidden from them and the systematic nature of the betrayal their own government had perpetrated. Mr. Rivera, Senator Patricia Hayes, asked during a break in questioning that had lasted most of the day, "In your opinion, based on what you've discovered and what we've learned through these hearings, could something like Project Coldstream happen again?" Marcus considered the question carefully, thinking about everything he'd learned since that first night in the control room. "Senator, Project Coldstream never ended. It just became more sophisticated, more integrated into legitimate systems. What we've exposed is just one branch of a tree with roots that go much deeper than any of us initially realized. What would you recommend to prevent similar abuses in the future?" Marcus looked out over the packed hearing room, filled with veterans, family members, journalists, and ordinary citizens who'd been following the story for months with growing amazement and anger. Transparency in all government operations, especially those involving veteran affairs. Real accountability for officials who abuse their positions. And recognition that the people who serve this country in uniform deserve to be treated as citizens with rights, not as assets to be used and discarded when they become inconvenient or expensive. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But most importantly, we need to remember that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they decide to use it, and stop accepting that things can't be changed. What happened here didn't start with some grand plan to expose corruption or reform government. It started with one person who was broke and desperate, and bought an abandoned building for $800 because he needed a place to hide from the world, and found $200 million in cash. Senator Hayes added with a smile that suggested she understood the irony. "No," Marcus replied, shaking his head. "I found something much more valuable than money. I found proof that the system can be changed when people refuse to accept that it can't be. I found allies who were willing to risk everything for something bigger than themselves. And I found purpose that went beyond just surviving from one day to the next." The congressional hearings continued for months, but their most important work had been completed before they began. The network of veterans, activists, and ordinary citizens that had coalesced around the Coldstream investigation had developed its own momentum, its own funding sources, and its own political agenda that extended far beyond the specific crimes they'd uncovered. By autumn, the abandoned airport terminal had been transformed into something Marcus had never imagined when he'd first broken through those sealed doors. The federal government, as part of the comprehensive legal settlement that emerged from the criminal prosecutions, had provided funding to convert the facility into a state-of-the-art veteran rehabilitation center that would serve as a model for similar programs nationwide. The control room where Marcus had first discovered the money became the center's administration office, its walls now lined with photographs of veterans who'd found new purpose through the programs offered there. The cargo bays became workshops where veterans learned construction trades, electronics repair, and mechanical skills that could translate into civilian careers. The former gate areas became classrooms, therapy rooms, and meeting spaces for support groups that addressed everything from combat trauma to substance abuse to the peculiar challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life. But the terminal's most important feature was something that couldn't be seen by casual visitors: a secure communication center where veterans from across the country could coordinate investigations, share information about suspicious activities, and organize political action that held government accountable to the people who'd sacrificed the most for it. The abandoned airport had become a command center for ongoing efforts to ensure that the promises made to veterans were actually kept and that the people who served their country received the respect and support they'd earned through that service. On a cold December evening, almost exactly 1 year after he'd first broken through the sealed door, Marcus stood in what had once been an empty, echoing terminal and watched dozens of veterans working, learning, healing, and planning. Some were attending classes that would help them transition to civilian careers. Others were participating in therapy groups that addressed the invisible wounds of war with the same systematic attention that military medicine gave to physical injuries. Still others were coordinating with veteran organizations in other states, sharing techniques for investigating suspicious activities and holding officials accountable for their promises and their failures. Tommy Costa approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee that actually tasted good, one of many improvements that had come with federal funding and professional management. "Any regrets?" Tommy asked, settling into a chair that looked out over the transformed space. Marcus looked around at the bustling activity, at people who'd found purpose and community after years of isolation and struggle. Through the windows, he could see construction crews working on additional buildings that would house families, while veterans underwent long-term rehabilitation, expansion that had been funded through the recovery of additional stolen assets that investigations continued to uncover. "Just one," Marcus said after thinking about the question for a moment. "What's that?" "I regret that it took me so long to realize I wasn't alone, that there were other people fighting the same battles and facing the same struggles, that I spent so many years thinking I had to carry everything by myself." Tommy smiled, understanding the sentiment completely. "You weren't ready before. None of us were. Sometimes, the right person has to find the right cause at exactly the right moment, when they're desperate enough to take risks they wouldn't normally consider. Think it'll last? This momentum, this change, this sense that things can actually get better." Tommy pointed to a group of young veterans working with older ones on a project that involved teaching technical skills while addressing the social isolation that too many veterans experienced after leaving military service. "I think," he said slowly, "that we've reminded people of something they'd forgotten but never completely lost, that they have power when they choose to use it. That they matter in ways that go beyond what politicians tell them during election years. That's not something you can put back in a box once it's been released into the world." As if to prove his point, Sarah McKenna approached with a tablet showing news feeds from across the country. Similar veteran-led investigations were underway in a dozen states, using techniques developed during their Coldstream investigation. Corporate executives were being arrested for fraud that had diverted funds meant for veteran programs. Politicians were retiring rather than facing corruption charges that would destroy their careers and reputations. And everywhere, people who'd been taught to accept systemic abuse were discovering they had alternatives, that organized resistance could produce real change when it was sustained and systematic. "It's spreading," Sarah said, with the satisfaction of someone whose technical skills had finally found a purpose worthy of her talents. "The networks we built, the methods we developed, the communication systems we created. Other groups are adapting them for their own fights. It's becoming bigger than Coldstream, bigger than veteran issues, bigger than any single cause. Becoming what? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Democracy, she replied without hesitation. Real democracy, where ordinary people have the tools and the courage to hold power accountable, where the people who serve get the respect and support they deserve, and where promises made are promises kept. Marcus smiled, thinking about the scared, broken veteran who'd bought an abandoned building for $800 and found more than he'd ever dreamed possible, hidden beneath years of dust and bureaucratic neglect. He'd bought the terminal hoping to find a place to hide from a world that had become too loud, too demanding, too full of sounds and situations that triggered memories he couldn't control. Instead, he'd found the strength to change that world in ways that mattered. 1 year later, the Coldstream investigation had resulted in 67 federal indictments, the recovery of over $8 billion in misappropriated funds, and the implementation of new oversight procedures for all government contracts involving veteran services. Congressional legislation had been passed that guaranteed transparent accounting for all veteran-related expenditures and established independent oversight boards with real authority to investigate suspicious activities. But those were just numbers, statistics that appeared in government reports and newspaper articles. The real change was harder to quantify but impossible to miss. A generation of veterans who'd found their voices and learned to use them effectively. A network of citizens who'd discovered the power of organized resistance. And a country that was slowly remembering that democracy required active participation from everyone, not just those with the most money or the best connections. The abandoned airport terminal had become a symbol of transformation, proof that something discarded and forgotten could become the foundation for something powerful and lasting, when it was claimed by people who understood its true value. And Marcus Rivera, who'd once thought his story was over, who'd believed his best days were behind him, and that survival was the highest goal he could reasonably aspire to, discovered that his real life was just beginning. At the dedication ceremony for the completed rehabilitation center, Marcus was asked to speak to a crowd that included veterans from across the country, family members who'd watched loved ones struggle with systems that seemed designed to break them down, government officials who'd learned the hard way that accountability mattered, and media representatives from around the world who'd been covering the story since it first broke. He stood at a podium that had been placed exactly where he'd first discovered the sealed door to the control room, looking out at faces that reflected hope instead of despair, purpose instead of resignation, strength instead of the defeated acceptance he'd seen in too many eyes for too many years. A lot of people have asked me, Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd, what I was looking for when I bought this place. The truth is, I wasn't looking for anything except a place to hide from problems I couldn't solve and memories I couldn't forget. He paused, gathering his thoughts and looking out over the faces that were listening with the focused attention that important moments deserved. But sometimes the thing we most need to find is the thing we're most afraid to look for. I was afraid to believe that one person could make a difference in systems that seemed too big and too powerful to change. I was afraid to trust that other people would stand up when it mattered, that they'd risk their own safety for principles that couldn't be easily explained or quickly rewarded. He gestured toward the transformed terminal, its windows bright with electric light, its walls echoing with conversations about healing and hope, rather than despair and abandonment. What I learned, is that hope isn't something you wait for like good weather or government benefits. It's something you build with your own hands, your own courage, your own willingness to take risks for something bigger than personal comfort or safety. The crowd was silent, listening with the kind of attention that indicated they understood they were hearing something important, something that might change how they thought about their own possibilities. Every person here has the power to change the world, not through violence, not through hate, but through the simple decision to refuse to accept injustice as inevitable, to refuse to stay quiet when they see wrong being done, and to refuse to accept that ordinary people don't matter. He smiled, thinking about the scared veteran who'd once sat alone in a control room surrounded by evidence of corruption, and believing he was powerless to do anything about it except hide. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to open a door that everyone else assumes should stay closed. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up and say, "This isn't right, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to believe that truth matters more than comfort, and that justice is worth fighting for, even when victory seems impossible. Marcus looked out at the faces in the crowd, seeing veterans who'd found purpose after years of drift, activists who'd discovered their power after decades of feeling helpless, and ordinary citizens who'd learned they were anything but ordinary when they decided to act on their convictions. That door is always there, he concluded. The question isn't whether you have the power to open it. The question is whether you have the courage to walk through it and see what's on the other side. The applause that followed wasn't just approval, it was recognition. Recognition that they'd all been part of something that had changed not just their own lives, but the lives of countless people they'd never meet. People who would benefit from the accountability they'd demanded and the systems they'd reformed. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, many stopping to shake hands and share stories about their own struggles with bureaucratic indifference and systematic neglect, Marcus remained at the podium, looking out over the facility that had risen from abandonment and decay. In the distance, he could see the control tower where everything had begun, now converted into a communications center that coordinated veteran advocacy efforts across the nation, and served as a model for similar operations in other countries where veterans faced similar challenges. The circle was complete, but the story would never end. Because the most important thing Marcus had discovered in that sealed room wasn't hidden money or government secrets that could destroy careers and topple administrations. It was the realization that ordinary people, when they refuse to remain silent in the face of injustice, have the power to accomplish things that seem extraordinary until you understand that they're actually the natural result of courage, applied systematically and persistently over time. 5 years later, Marcus stood in the same spot during the center's anniversary celebration, but everything around him had changed in ways that still amazed him when he stopped to think about how far they'd all come. The facility now served as the flagship of a national network of veteran rehabilitation centers that had helped thousands of veterans transition successfully to civilian life while maintaining the connections and sense of purpose that military service had provided. The broader investigation that had grown from the Coldstream discovery had resulted in comprehensive reform of veteran services, with transparent accounting, independent oversight, and accountability measures that ensured promises made were promises kept. More importantly, it had created a culture where veterans understood they had voices that mattered and systems for making those voices heard by people with the power to respond effectively. Marcus himself had been transformed in ways that went far beyond his role as the center's director and the public face of veteran advocacy efforts. The nightmares that had followed him home from Afghanistan hadn't disappeared completely, but they'd been joined by dreams about the future, about projects that mattered, and people who depended on his leadership. The hypervigilance that had once made crowds and public spaces feel like threat environments had been redirected into strategic thinking about long-term goals and systematic approaches to complex problems. The isolation that had once seemed like his only option for managing trauma had been replaced by community and shared purpose that gave meaning to experiences that had once seemed senseless. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus had learned that healing wasn't something that happened to you while you waited passively for time to work its magic. It was something you accomplished through action, through commitment to causes larger than yourself, through the daily choice to build something better, rather than simply endure what existed. Anyone can change the world if they're willing to open the right door, stand with the right people, and fight for the right cause. The question isn't whether you have the power, it's whether you have the courage to use it when the moment comes, and everything depends on your willingness to act. Marcus Rivera bought an abandoned airport terminal for $800, thinking he was purchasing a place to disappear from a world that had become too painful to navigate. Instead, he discovered something far more valuable than the $200 million hidden in its walls. He found his voice, his purpose, and proof that one person's courage can awaken the power that sleeps in all of us, waiting for the right moment to change everything. Because sometimes, the most abandoned places are just waiting for the right person to give them new life. And sometimes, the most broken people are exactly the ones the world needs to help fix what's wrong. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible true stories that will restore your faith in the power of ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. Click now to continue the journey. And don't forget to subscribe if you believe that courage is contagious and justice is worth fighting for.